today for this very special book launch of a collaboration between the United Nations University Network as well as others. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies at the United Nations University Merit and also Maastricht University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this exciting book launch. So, this book was put together by Glenn Ripe, Elsa Rusin, and Katrin Marchen, who are from different institutions of the UNU network. This book specifically looks at regional integration and migration governance in the global south. So, there are several things that this book tries to do. This book deals with major challenges of migration in the global south and their governance, of course. And during this book launch, we have some of the authors from a few of the chapters to give you a glimpse into the book. Of course, this is just a drop in the bucket, so we definitely encourage all of you to get the book, of course. But hopefully, this will give you some ideas as to what the book offers. We're very happy to also have today with us Maureen Achik, who is the IOM representative to the African Union, who will also comment on the book and what the book has to offer. I think it's very timely that we're able to do this book launch also on International Migrants Day. So thank you to everyone for being with us and being part of this. So just a little bit about the United Nations University Migration Network. So this is a network of all the different UNU institutions working on migration issues. Many of us come at this from different points of view, from maybe either more development side or regional integration side or health or many other perspectives. We currently have 7 members of the United Nations University Network in general that are part of our migration network. And if you're interested in more of our work there, also, I would definitely urge you to go to our website at migration.unu.edu to check out more of the work that we do here. But in this book, this is one of the many collaborations of the network, also, of course, with contributions from others. And we hope that you all enjoy it. I think I will leave it there now and turn it over to Glenn.
Thank you, Melissa. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for participating to this book launch event, the launch event of the book Regional Integration and Migration Governance in the Global South that I edited together with Ilse Ruyssen and Katrin Marchand. Rather than, let's say, presenting in detail the book, we wanted to seize the occasion of this book launch to have a discussion about what should be the priorities in migration governance in and for the Global South. Precisely, that was the motive. So a couple of years ago, that was the motivation of proposing this book and editing this book, using the knowledge, the expertise, and the studies that have been made within the United Nations University Migration Network. The idea of the book dates back from the period of the signature of the Global Compact on migration, and then after the signature, you have the following up question now: well, what should be on the agenda of migration governance? And with this book, we hope to make a modest contribution to this discussion. Its structure is rather straightforward. It has 2 main chapters, 2 main parts, rather. The one on the patterns of movements in the Global South and the drivers of migration in the Global South. And the second one, which is more a review, a critical review and analysis of systems of migration governance that already exist in the Global South and the challenges in these migration governance systems. Yes, as Melissa has already said, so we started discussion with the presentation of 4 chapters from this book. That should give, I think, a lot of elements of reflection on the question of priorities in migration governance. And then we're looking forward to the intervention of Mrs. Maureen Acheng to give her thoughts on what should be priorities or what are the priorities in migration governance. That will also start a discussion on the issue with the panel members, but also with all the participants. Okay, thank you. So I think I can now give the floor to Ilse, who is the first speaker, who will continue, yes, on migration and climate change.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here also from my side. I'll give a bit of an overview of the key findings of the chapter dealing with human migration in the face of environmental change, a global empirical approach, which I've written together with my PhD student Els Bekart and a former postdoc, Sarah Salomone at our department. So climate change and migration, I don't have to tell you, take center stage in daily news reports. They have shaped debates during many of the recent elections worldwide. Climate change is affecting weather patterns, ecosystems, and sea levels, and consequently, an increasing number of people and countries on our planet are confronted with severe environmental problems. Broadly speaking, we can distinguish between, on the one hand, fast or sudden onset hazards, which in the literature are sometimes also referred to as natural disasters, such as floods, storms, tropical cyclones. And then on the other hand, there are the slow or gradual onset hazards, such as gradual changes in precipitation or in temperatures, desertification, and sea level rise. Now, both of these types of environmental hazards directly impact people's lives and increasingly threaten livelihoods of entire communities. And when severe environmental events are recurrent and people lack the means to diversify their assets and livelihoods, moving away from the deteriorating environment might be the only alternative. In the past, already in 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, put forward human migration as the greatest impact of environmental change. And today, in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, there's also attention for environmental degradation, natural disasters, and climate change as drivers of contemporary migration. So this is clearly identified. And in response, the Compact also stresses the need for more investments focused on strengthening evidence, data, and research to address environmental migration challenges. Now, what do we know about the numbers? How many climate or environmental migrants are we talking about? Or can we expect? According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, an estimated 227 million people worldwide were displaced within their country because of sudden onset environmental hazards between the period 2008-2016. And in 2017, the number of environmentally displaced within their country was estimated at 18.8 million people in 135 countries, which is far larger number than the 11.8 million internally displaced people we know due to conflict and violence. They are mostly located in South and East Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. But you also see that quantifications of cross-border movement, so international migration in the context of disaster, are much more scarce and challenging, and that also predictions in relation to slow onset hazards are lacking primarily. So in general, you could say forecasts vary between 25 million to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050, who would move either internally or internationally and with 200 million being the most widely cited estimate. Well-planned migration can form a successful strategy to cope with environmental problems when there is no credible long-term pathway to viable livelihoods. But given the development implications of migration for both sending and destination regions, it's important that governments are able to anticipate the scale of ensuing migration flows and also the places people will move to or stay in. So in the chapter, we provide a comprehensive overview of the potential transmission channels underlying the climate migration nexus. So this is these are like scattered through the literature, but hadn't really been brought together. So on the one hand, we see studies showing a direct impact of climate change on migration because of its effect on human survival, but also because people anticipate future shocks, they might also be more inclined to migrate. And then there are also all these indirect channels of transmission through which climate change can influence migration. The most famous one, or the one that has reached the most attention, is this agricultural income channel, or the income channel in general, which is related to the fact that climate change reduces crop yield and hence has a negative impact on agricultural income, which might spur people's mobility. On the other hand, it's also possible that people are pushed even further into poverty and that they are increasingly trapped in unviable areas, in the sense that climate change might also worsen liquidity constraints, so that it's not necessarily the case that everybody seeing his or her income decreasing will eventually, because of climate change, will eventually also have the opportunity to migrate. And then there are also other channels related to the impact of climate change on availability and quality of amenities, on how climate change might spur conflict, on impact on institutions, on urbanization, etc., all of which might also be associated with more or less migration. So the overview kind of shows that the relationship between the environment and migration is not clear-cut, which also hampers accurate inference on the impact of environmental hazards on migration. The literature typically doesn't identify these channels at play, or when they do, the focus has mainly lied on this agricultural income channel. And then the chapter also provides an overview of the current stance of the empirical literature on the migration response to environmental hazards. I will not go over this in great depth, but just to give you an idea how it is built up, and these aspects matter actually to come to a consensus about the effects. So we distinguish between research focusing on internal migration versus international migration responses, and also on studies which have typically either looked at the impact of slow onset hazards or sudden onset hazards. This literature is quite large, actually. There is a lot of work that has already been done, but at the same time, there's no consensus yet on the role of environmental factors as determinants of global migration. You see some of the recent overview papers listed here, and you see that there are studies showing indeed an increase in migration because of climate change, but others do not find evidence for this relationship, or yet others even find evidence for a negative effect, with climate change reducing migration and mobility and leaving people trapped in increasingly unviable areas. Overall, you see that the literature provides more rich and conclusive evidence on the impact of environmental factors on internal migration as opposed to international migration. But there, when it comes to internal migration, these outcomes are typically based on case studies, which makes generalization and comparison across countries rather difficult. So the analysis that we conduct in this chapter attempts to bridge the gap a bit between these two types of studies, the micro studies, which make use of individual level data, and macro studies, which make use typically of country level or regional level data, and also the two types of migration. We look into both internal and international migration responses. We relied in the chapter on the Gallup World Poll dataset, which collects information among others on individual migration intentions, as well as people's exposure to severe environmental problems, our key variables of interest, and then also a whole series of personal and household characteristics for a large number of countries. So with these data, we were able to empirically estimate the influence of recent exposure to environmental hazards on people's stated short-term migration intentions. And we tested also for differences in migration responses in rural versus urban areas, in different geographic regions, depending on countries' level of development and also household wealth. Just to give you an idea, so we have data for all the countries that appear in color here, and you see for each country in our sample the percentage of individuals who have experienced severe environmental problems in the past year. You clearly see differences across countries, but still in most countries in the world, people seem to indicate that they have experienced such problems in the last year. And then these data were matched at the individual level, even though I'm showing country aggregates here, with information on people's intention to move within the next year, either through internal or international migration. And so here you see the country aggregates for this question shown here, and we could also plot the two variables against each other at country level, which is what we've done here, which shows or hints already a bit towards a positive relationship. But in the chapter, we conduct a multivariate analysis to test for the causal impact, basically, of this experience of environmental shocks on migration intention. So what are the key findings? We do find that there's an impact of this exposure to environmental hazards in the past year on intentions to migrate, but also that this response varies a lot with the area where which you consider this residential area. A bigger response is found in urban areas. We also find differences for different country groups. For instance, severe environmental problems are associated with a higher probability of intending to move in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe and North America, while in Asia, the effect is only significant for a fraction of respondents, basically mostly residents in urban areas. And also we see that the impact crucially depends on the household wealth, whether or not people actually intend to respond by migrating in the next year. So to conclude, basically the main takeaway is probably that this preliminary analysis shows how important it is, or how the literature can gain from bringing this kind of information together using an integrated approach, which allows to combine micro and macro level information, so individual level information and country level information, and also to perhaps look into internal and international migration at the same time. And in follow-up research, we actually built also further on this. Also because such an integrated approach allows to explore heterogeneity in migration responses across countries, across groups of people, which is clearly there, right? So I will leave it here and I'll give the floor to Melissa for the second chapter.
Thank you, Ilse. So I already introduced myself before, but for those who have just joined the call, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies and head of migration studies at UNU Merit and also Maastricht University. And this is joint work with my co-author, Lisa Anderson, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today because fortunately she recently had a baby and is currently on maternity leave. So, what we did in this chapter is basically a review of the empirical literature on the impact of migration on development in developing countries. Now, of course, in this brief overview, there's no way that we can actually go through all of that literature, but I'll try to pull out some of the highlights and things that we found along the way. So, if you're interested, please do check out the chapter. So, when looking at migration and development, there's been, quite a debate over time. This is not a new topic. From more optimistic to more pessimistic views over time of these linkages. And of course, there's also discussion of both how migration affects development, but also how development affects migration. In this chapter specifically, we're really just looking at how migration affects development outcomes. And the discussion around migration and development, really started much more from the perspective of looking at remittances. But now we've moved into a much broader range of development processes, looking at human capital investments, diaspora networks, transfers of things that are, more than money. So things like cultural norms, political ideas, knowledge more generally. And a lot of the mechanisms that we see through which migration can affect different outcomes is obviously by more money or more capital being in the household, by having more ideas and knowledge transfers, networks, and also the actual absence of a person in the household and what kind of effects that can have. Now, as far as the chapter is concerned, what we wanted to do in this chapter, some more the aims and scope of this chapter, is specifically to bring together the empirical evidence on this topic. So we looked specifically at quantitative studies from many different disciplines with a very broad definition of both migration and development. So we wanted this to be as encompassing as possible. And we look at different aspects and different outcomes. And what we definitely find is that a lot of the literature is not conclusive, and there are many research gaps. So we also here focus specifically on the global south, and more specifically um, countries of origin of migrants in the global south. While of course migrants can be coming from many different places of origin, we're looking at those specifically in the global south. Now, we look already, as I said, at a wide range of migration, looking at both voluntary and involuntary means of migration, and an encompassing kind of holistic view of development along four specific areas. So if we move along to the next slide, you'll see here that we look specifically at economic development, social development, institutional development, and environmental development. This was just our way of organizing the chapter. Of course, it doesn't mean that there can't be other ways of looking at the development. And within each of these areas, we looked at several subgroups of this type of development. Again, this is not all encompassing. This is just the way that we decided to organize the chapter. So of course, you can also have discussions around what exactly is development, what should be included, should education be on the social side or on the economic side. That's really not the important discussion here. The important point is what are the effects that we see in this regard, and this is just how we decided to organize it. So if we start specifically looking at the impacts of migration on economic development, we really see that the majority of literature that looks at the impacts of migration on development is really focused on at least what we have clustered more around this economic development section. And if we look at this in different areas, first, for instance, if we look more at the macro literature, looking at economic growth, we see that remittances have shown to have very positive effects on growth in studies covering a large set of developing countries, also in studies covering specific geographical areas such as North Africa or Latin America or the Caribbean. But we also see this in individual country studies like in Pakistan or Kyrgyzstan or Ecuador. However, though, not all studies show positive effects. Some actually show no effect or a negative impact of specifically remittances on growth. And I should also say that when we're looking at the impact of migration on development in general, many authors don't necessarily disentangle the effects of migration compared to those of remittances. And a lot of In this case, when looking at growth, a lot of the authors are specifically looking at the effects of remittances on growth, so not just migration more generally. And some of these negative impacts that we can see, or lack of an impact on growth, really comes from the fact that the inflow of remittances may cause a real appreciation of the exchange rate, and this leads to so-called Dutch disease, which could decrease export performance and limit output and employment. It's also been argued that remittances can also cause moral hazard problems that reduce the work efforts of household members receiving remittances. So these are some of the negative sides of remittances that we can see. When looking at poverty and inequality, there is empirical evidence using both macro and micro level data. And what's very clear is that the general trend is that migration really leads to a reduction in poverty levels, specifically because of the sending of remittances. And this is a pretty robust finding across much of the literature. If we look at inequality, though, the distributional impacts are less conclusive. So in some cases, migration can lead to a reduction in inequality. In other cases, it can lead to an increase in inequality. And this really depends on who it is that is migrating. So from which part of kind of the socioeconomic distribution is leaving the country, as to whether this causes more or less inequality. If we move on to issues of saving, investments, and financial sector development here, we see that remittances can help households smooth their consumption and overcome financial constraints and allow them to make productive investments, especially in contexts with limited access to credit and underdeveloped financial markets. But it's also often argued that households spend remittances on daily consumption rather than long-term investments in productive assets and activities. So, of course, while spending in general can lead to more development, it is often the case that remittances are spent on consumption, and this may then have less of an impact on savings and investment and general financial sector development. So in this area, the empirical literature is really quite mixed on what the impacts are here. If we look at labor, entrepreneurship, and employment outcomes, so migration and remittances can influence labor supply and employment outcomes of both the remaining members in the household and the migrant who decides to return to their country of origin. So if the migrant or the people who are receiving remittances, for instance, feel that they no longer need to work because money is just coming back, then this can reduce labor supply. However, remittances coming back can also be investment. It can be invested into, small and medium-sized enterprises, and can also allow for more entrepreneurship. So we do see that the direction here is not necessarily clear, or is not all encompassing with regard to the evidence in the field, that it can both increase and decrease labor supply. If we move on to social development outcomes, if we look at the area of education, migration and remittances can affect education through multiple channels. Remittances can reduce budget constraints and allow households to spend more on education, and we absolutely see this. But there's also the impact of migration on educational incentives of those who are left behind. So here in many cases, we see that the fact that there is migration from a specific area will often induce people to gain more educational experience, in that this may allow them to also move in the future. It can, in some cases, though, have an opposite effect, where there's perhaps not more returns to education. So especially, for instance, in the case of Mexico and let's say adolescent or teenage young men moving to the United States, it could also reduce educational outcomes. So there is definitely mixed evidence in this regard, but one thing that is very clear is that usually remittances tend to encourage household investment in education. So if we turn to health, migration and remittances can have both a direct and indirect, so it can have both a direct and indirect effect on health spending outcomes and practices. What we do see is that there's usually an increase in spending on healthcare, but this is usually to help to alleviate shocks. The results are more ambiguous when it comes to the impacts on child health. especially if we look at the differences between physical and mental health. So in many cases, we see an increase in physical health, but sometimes also a decrease in mental health. So there are, again, differing impacts on health. There's also a difference in the short and long term. If we look also at gender roles and decision-making power, migration can definitely affect gender norms, relations, and behaviors among migrants and their family members in the host country and in the country of origin. And most of the studies look at two types of effects. So a migrant absent effect and the migrant experience effect. And we see that here, this can also go in different ways. So in some cases, it allows for more autonomy, for instance, of women and decision-making power, but in other cases, we see a reduction in that. So it really depends on who stays behind, who migrates, and what the country context is. If we move on to institutional and political development, here the effect is largely dependent on the characteristics and the experiences of the migrants. So if we look at, for instance, things under institutional reform and democracy, there are three main strands of empirical literature in the field. There are studies that look at the impacts of institutions on migration decisions, the effects of migration on institutional reform, and the impact of migration um, on social and informal institutions in the host countries. So there are many channels that can explain how and why migration affects institutions and democracy in the migrant's country of origin. So migrants might be inspired by observing a positive link between the level of institutional development and well-being in the countries of destination, and of course then wanting to influence institutions in their country of origin while still in the destination country or upon return, because they also would like to see these same levels of development in their own country. And they will, in general, they often also want to improve institutions to secure well-being for their family members that stay behind, and to improve prospects for things like entrepreneurship or investment, which could be important in the future. But like most of the other areas, the empirical literature on this is also mixed. Another area that we also see, though, is on technological development and knowledge diffusion. So migrants can bring back valuable technology and scientific knowledge to their country of origin and help develop national scientific knowledge institutions and innovation. And this is seen quite clearly in really the impact of migrants in this field. Now, finally, if we turn to environmental development, here the literature on the impact of natural disasters and climate change on migration really focuses on decisions and flows of migrants. There is also a small and growing literature on the effect of migration on environmental development and resilience, but this is still a smaller literature. While most of the literature currently now focuses on theoretical linkages and small scale case studies, there is really a lack of empirical evidence from larger scale surveys at the source. So that's really an area where more research needs to be done. There's also the literature also looks at how countries and communities are affected by climate change and natural disasters, and how really this depends on their vulnerability and ability to adapt. So I think a lot of this, of course, is very much in line with what we just heard in the previous talk. What we currently see from the literature is that the low diversity of income generating activities in areas that are exposed to natural disasters and climate change increases households' vulnerability to climate change, environmental stressors, and market failures. And migration then can, in these circumstances, both be a coping strategy and facilitate adaptation. Another strand of the literature looks at how migration itself can indirectly affect or also directly affect environmental development through the impact and choices of use of fuels. So this can be both negative and positive. So in some cases, you might see migrants moving to certain areas, or for instance, refugees that do a lot of clear cutting and cutting down trees for firewood and burning that wood. But we also see that, Mexican migrants in the United States have also helped to decrease households' reliance on firewood collection in favor of stove and gas purchases in Mexico. So then they're not kind of openly burning firewood. So again, evidence mixed in this regard. So if we come to kind of the conclusions, I think what you could already see from the points that I've made is that the evidence shows that migration through emigration, remittances, and return can have both a positive and negative, direct and indirect impacts on development. As I said before, the evidence related to the economic and social development is relatively large, but not entirely conclusive. And there's much less evidence for the effects on institutional and environmental development, but this is growing. Although migration is beneficial for development in many ways, it does also imply costs. And the most striking of these is perhaps the negative health outcomes for migrants and their families in terms of the prevalence of mental disorders and substance abuse. So really focusing here more on mental health issues. The evidence also highlights the complex relationship between migration and development, where findings are often context specific and where different aspects of migration may have opposite impacts on development. So for instance, on one hand, remittances might be increasing development on one hand, while the absence of a person might be decreasing other aspects of development like mental health. Another striking feature in this review is the concentration of the papers to certain regional or country contexts. So for instance, really a lot of literature specifically on Latin America and even more specifically on Mexico, and much less in other areas of the world that have really been overlooked. This highlights the importance for future research to sufficiently disaggregate the analysis of the migration development nexus by migrant outcome and make sure that evidence has a broad geographical coverage. So I think I'll leave it there now for the review of the literature here. I know that was a lot to take in, but please do check out the actual chapter. Now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Risha Shivakoty, who's going to look specifically at Asian migration governance. And maybe just to a reminder to everyone, something we didn't say before is that, of course, we're going to have a question and answer round. So if you do already have questions, please feel free to already start to put those in the chat so you don't forget your questions later. So Risha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Toronto. I am happy to be back with the UNU network. And I wrote this chapter while I was at UNU Maastricht with Melissa and Katrin and everyone. So I wanted to present my chapter on Asian migration governance. And so basically mobility within and outside of Asia has grown dramatically over the past several decades, and new systems of migration and regional governance are emerging. So as of 2017, 80 million international migrants were residing in Asia, and it has become one of the fastest growing migration corridors in the world. It took in 30 million international migrants between 2000 and 2017. And in 2017, intra-regional migration within Asia accounted for 60% of its international migration stock, in addition to 20 million out migrants to Europe and 17 million migrants to North America. So this chapter basically explores the current migration mechanisms within Asia as the migration boom, makes it timely to understand it. And it looks actually specifically at various trans-regional governance networks at play in Asia, and with a special focus on labor migration governance between South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So for regional migration, the magnitude and direction has grown so much, but specifically for labor migration, it has become really quite vital to the region with circular or temporary migration and also the remittances that they bring. And it will continue to be an important factor in the foreseeable future. And within Asia, there have been a lot of different types of various vibrant developments in regional cooperation in migration, especially with a lack of a global migration regime. There has been state and non-state actors coming together to discuss issues related to migration. And there are formal, informal gatherings, which have over time just provided a venue and opportunity for organized states and other non-state actors to come together and share their perspective. So migration governance, the next slide, please, in Asia is quite intriguing because at the one hand, Asian states have refused to be part of several migration-related, UN conventions and such. They also don't have a legal, regional legal body. But on the other hand, they've made quite significant efforts toward, bilateral or regional level cooperation. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit. And so for Asia and international conventions, it has one of the lowest ratifications on UN covenants and conventions. And many of the countries have not been parties of this. So next slide, please. Have not been party to this. And I wanted to just give a quick overview of some of the conventions and where Asian countries stand, kind of. So the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, states that there are 9 core international human rights instruments. And we can see a range among the countries of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the and the Gulf Cooperation countries, actually, that like for CEDAW, the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has been ratified by all of them. But for others that are like for the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, and for International Convention of the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, they've been ratified by only very few. So in the next slide, yeah, we can see the map of, especially for the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. And it has only been ratified by very few countries in Asia. And those are in blue. And you can see the vast majority in orange that have not taken any action to it. So for the next slide, yeah, I also wanted to touch on the 8 fundamental ILO labor conventions. And here too, within these countries, we can see a range. So like example, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines have ratified all of the conventions. Well, there are some countries smaller like Maldives and Bhutan, which have ratified none of them. So it makes it quite interesting. The transgovernmental migration networks become important in this aspect on what is happening besides conventions. So there are lots of state-led and non-state-led cooperations that are happening. For the state-led, a very important one is bilateral agreements, for labor agreements. So it's easier in some ways, it's country to country, you can come to an agreement easier in some ways. But then there's a big power imbalance between labor sending countries and labor receiving countries. And usually the receiving countries are both strong politically and economically in most cases. So these are sometimes detrimental to labor receiving countries as they're competing to get jobs for their migrant workers. Sorry. For the regional human rights body, Asia as a region doesn't have an established regional human rights body. For example, it has been more developed in Africa or Europe or the Americas, but in Asia it's still less so. There's been some progress with 2 sub-regional human rights bodies, the Arab Human Rights Committee and the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, but neither of them have established a human rights court yet. And sorry. Another important regional cooperation happens within regional blocks. So for Southeast Asia, there's the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. For South Asia, there's South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC, and for the Gulf countries is the Gulf Cooperation Councils, and they have various meetings that are state-led on various issues, including migration. So among these three, ASEAN is maybe more developed because they're currently embarking on deeper regional economic integration through the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. So they're hoping for, freer flow of goods, services, and people by 2025. SARC, the South Asian bloc, SARC, is home to a large number of migrants that go to other countries with, countries like India, Bangladesh, large populations. And there's also a lot of inter-migration within SARC region, but that has been, less progress has been made on discussing specifically issues within SARC countries for labor migration. The Gulf Cooperation countries are an interesting bloc. They're consisting of 6 member states: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And they comprise of the largest regional hub for international migrants, and skilled and less skilled workers in large numbers go and work in these GCC countries. And they're governed, especially for migrant labor populations, is through the kafala laws or work sponsorship programs. And this has been quite a contentious issue for labor sending and labor receiving countries on how it works and what kind of rights migrant workers have through them. Another state-led cooperation for migration is quite important is the regional consultative processes that happen where states meet repeatedly to talk about migration issues. And these are state-owned, but non-binding and informal. So it's more to have that level of trust over time on certain issues. And there are several that are quite important for Asia, like the Bali process on people smuggling, trafficking, and trafficking in persons and related transnational crime. It was established in 2002. And it's also voluntary and non-binding process, but it's important in sharing information and coordination of practical matters related to smuggling and trafficking. There's others that are specifically related to labor migration. Colombo process is one that is among labor sending countries in Asia. So many from South Asia and Southeast Asia have been members there and have been meeting in regular intervals. From the Colombo process, it was interesting that there were 2 offshoots that came out of it. One was the Asia-EU dialogue on labor migration. So it's with Asian countries from the 11 Colombo Colombo process countries, and 27 EU countries that talk about managed and legal migration. And the other one is the Abu Dhabi dialogue, which is also this informal state-led process that they meet, but it is with 2 regions, the labor sending countries and the labor receiving countries in the Middle East mostly. So it currently has like about 20 state members. So these are some important state-led cooperation. And for the non-state-led cooperation in the next slide, also quite important because there are a lot of vibrant actors in Asia, especially that work on these migrant issues, NGOs, migrants themselves, trade unions, other non-state actors, quite important role. So for civil society organizations, it's quite active in Asia, and they are quite vibrant and work with grassroots communities in the sending countries, but are also kind of trying to extend their reach to labor sending countries, labor receiving countries. And also, So over time, like civil society organization was not really invited into these state-led discussions that were happening, like the Colombo process and others. But over time, they've really increased their presence. So at least they're now invited to, present their statements and opinions on certain issues before or after the regional consultative processes. So another important non-state-led cooperation effort is with trade unions, which are quite important because of their representation of workers and their collective bargaining and related issues for terms of wage and employment. But for Asian temporary labor migration, it poses a challenge for trade unions because it is by nature temporary and contract based, so usually a year or two maximum, and then it's a circular system that people come and go. And a lot of migrants are also in the informal sector. They're also undocumented workers. So for trade unions, it's a little bit difficult, and especially in some areas like even in Southeast Asia or the Gulf countries, political activism is not so easy for trade unions and other activist organizations to work on. So they really have to maneuver the different destination countries' laws and policies to work related. In Asia, so there are several trade union blocs, the Arab Trade Union Confederation, the ASEAN Trade Union Council, and the SARTUC, the South Asian Regional Trade Union. So they're working on different issues. So I just wanted to touch on all these different state and non-state level efforts that are happening in Asia to support labor migration. And for the challenges, because of the rapid growth of labor migration in Asia, it is something that is going to be continuing and going to be an important phenomenon. And this chapter basically introduced just the other related collaborative efforts. So the next slide. Sorry. And some of the challenges that we can see is basically that there really quite a difference in capacity and power imbalance, which is a major hurdle for many labor sending countries. And it has been quite difficult to work collectively to demand better rights and wages for their migrant workers. And it has been difficult because labor sending countries are kind of competing for the same jobs in certain countries over time, and they're competing more towards a race to the bottom rather than uplifting kind of work for migrant workers. But the regional consultative processes, the regional blocks, like all of this really have the potential to do more. And yeah, I hope that is something that comes out of these regional processes over time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Maud Martens, and I'm going to share some of the key messages of the chapter I wrote with Florian Trauner, who was my promoter at the time, and Ilke Adam, who are both from the Institute of European Studies at the VUB. And our chapter deals with the migration partnerships between the European Union and West African countries, and it mainly focuses on the migration development nexus and the conflicts and policy priorities between the European Union and its African partners. And to understand the context of these partnerships, we should go back to 2015, 2016, when these images were very common. You should remember that in 2015, there was a large rise in the numbers of arrivals of migrants in Europe. And at that moment, migration management rocketed to the top of the EU policy agenda. And in response to this perceived crisis, the European Union introduced the Migration Partnership Framework in 2016. I will probably often say MPF, so you know that it stands for the Migration Partnership Framework. With this framework, Now you can go back. With this framework, the EU seeks to cooperate with migrant sending countries and the transit countries through which migrants travel in order to deal with the challenges of irregular migration. And of course, they don't say it like that, but in fact, the MPF is a form of externalizing or outsourcing the EU's border management to third countries. And you could say that the EU is increasingly moving its borders southwards. Initially, the Migration Partnership Framework targeted 5 priority countries of origin and transit, which you can see on the next slide. So these were Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, Niger, and Ethiopia. And these countries were selected mainly based on their political will to engage in a dialogue on migration, but also on the number of irregular migrants in Europe and on previous cooperation on migration. So my research also focused on these 5 countries, but as the MPF its geographical scope extended, so now it includes also partnerships with other countries in Africa and Asia too. And the reason why I looked into the MPF was because at the time there was a lot of controversy about it. NGOs and pro-migrant activists were worried that the EU's security priorities would override its development agenda. And on the next slide, you see for example, 2 research papers of NGOs, one from the health advocates, global health advocates, titled Misplaced Trust, Diverting EU Aid to Stop Migration, and the other one from Concord with the title, The Externalization of Europe's Responsibilities. So I think you already get the message a bit. And it's easy to understand where this critique comes from, because the MPF is largely financed by development budgets. So these could be oriented to migration control instead of fighting poverty. Another major point of controversy in the Migration Partnership Framework is the use of conditionality. Oh, sorry, you can go back. Is the use of conditionality. Policy documents state that a mix of positive and negative incentives are used to reward the countries that are willing to cooperate on migration, but also to ensure that there are consequences for those who don't. So this is a typical stick and carrot approach. And for example, in many of these cases, it was the amount of development aid that was dependent on how willing the country was to cooperate on migration control. However, officials from the External Action Service and from DG DEFCO say that in the long term, only a more for more approach is workable, so a positive leverage approach. So this means if you cooperate, for example, you get more money. If you don't cooperate, we won't give you any less than before. So in fact, we see that migration objectives became more and more embedded in development policy domains. And it is even said that the Migration Partnership Framework interlinks security and development objectives. One consequence of this is the rhetoric of addressing the root causes of migration. And this is used throughout all the policy documents. And I mean, it sounds good. We are not just handling the symptoms of irregular migration, we are dealing with the root causes. And the root cause that is focused on mainly in these documents is economic underdevelopment. So by using development aid to target this, we are also working on our own domestic security objectives, namely fighting irregular migration. Now, the main question that I wanted to answer in my chapter was, is this development friendly, or are the NGOs right? And are we actually really undermining our own development efforts in these countries? And of course, this is not a yes or no question, but I think it's fair to say that the Migration Partnership Framework is not particularly directed at boosting development. But even though the MPF does not actively seek to use migration for the benefit of development, the EU has committed to ensure policy coherence for development. You can see this on the next slide. So policy coherence for development implies that all EU policies that are likely to affect developing countries need to comply with the development agenda. And this is, of course, necessary to avoid contradictions between policies. And policy coherence for development works with 5 broad themes, namely trade and security, climate change, food and nutrition, trade and finance, security and migration. So migration is an explicit theme in this, and this points again to the importance of the migration development nexus and on interlinking migration and development policies. And the criteria for policy coherence for development made it possible to evaluate the strategies that are used under the migration partnership framework and to assess if they are development friendly. And that's exactly what I did in my chapter. I don't have the time to go over all these strategies, but on the next slide, you already see some of them. I think it's mainly important to understand that these strategies range from strengthening border control, fighting migrant smuggling, creating agreements on return and readmission, creating also opportunities for regular migration, improving international protection and asylum policies, and as I said before, addressing the root causes of migration. And I believe that the variance in all these objectives translate the different interests of the European Union and the African partners. The focus of the EU in these negotiations were mainly on fighting irregular migration and on return and readmission, while the African priorities were more on increasing legal pathways for migration and on enhancing the migration development nexus. A problem in practice is, however, that these differing priorities are not very balanced. So when implemented, we see that the fight against irregular migration had the widest impact. And you could also say that it largely focuses on reducing arrivals to Europe. And I think that this absence of projects which are mainly in the interests of African actors demonstrates an unequal power relation in these partnerships. Now, does this undermine development in the partner countries? It is hard to say, because it is said that strengthening security and establishing border controls, it aims at disrupting smuggling networks and ending the crime relating to migration. And this can, of course, also benefit development. However, it is clear that we should avoid spending development budgets on pure security operations with little or no benefit to development. So this is one of my conclusions on the next slide. In terms of policy coherence for development, it is said that as long as security measures have a development component, it is okay. However, I believe this can be a bit of a gray zone sometimes. Another argument in my chapter is that the EU can do much more regarding to creating opportunities for legal migration. And I think Melissa's chapter suggested that that well-managed and legal migration can be a driver for development. It can reduce poverty and it can boost economic growth. And the EU has said it over the past 15 years that it is open to discussing legal pathways for migration, but they always fail to become a reality. So I think that if the European Union really wants to take into account the research on the migration development nexus, and if they really want to respect African demands in their partnerships, I think their framework should incorporate real strategies to facilitate a freer and safer flow of people, and that they should pay more attention to balance their security and migration objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Marina Cheng. If you can unmute yourself, she will be reflecting a bit on the book and in particular make the connection with priorities for migration governance in Africa. You have the floor, Maureen.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I hope you all can hear me. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion today. The occasion couldn't be more suited, seeing as it is International Migrants Day. So thank you again for having me. Well, I have to start off by saying I haven't seen the book, I haven't read the book, but just from the 4 chapter presentations, I think it contains very rich content, and I look forward to eventually laying my hands on it. Just a few reflections, and I'll go chapter by chapter based on those 4 presentations. On the first one, on human migration in the face of environmental change, a few thoughts from my side. Climate change is increasingly a key driver of migration on the African continent. It's not something we can talk about as likely to happen in some future horizon. It is a reality today as we speak. And the 2 regions of the continent that are likely to be the most affected are the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. The manifestations of migration, climate-induced migration that we're witnessing are both across borders as well as within borders. I think the chapter talked of internal versus external migration. But I think a better framing of it would be internal displacement versus external migration, because the 2 things are very different and play out in vastly different ways. And for the most part, it is internal displacement that we're witnessing, which is not to say that there isn't evidence for external migration that is clearly linked to climatic factors. In the Horn of Africa in the years 2016, 2017, a prolonged drought period, we saw a lot of people migrate to the Middle East. And in interviews conducted with many of them upon their return, they cited the long drought as being a trigger in their decision to migrate. We've seen a lot of negative coping mechanisms of families that send their young girls to get married as a coping mechanism, or to work abroad in some instances. And many of these people, many of these returning migrants have cited climatic factors as being central to their decision to migrate to the Middle East in search of work. So again, important to emphasize internal displacement versus external migration, a lot of it happening irregularly. And also to emphasize that this is happening, it's playing out right now as we speak, especially in those 2 regions of the continent, the Horn and the Sahel. So yes, we can expect, given predictions of how climate change is likely to play out, that we're likely to see even bigger numbers emigrate. A lot of it, unfortunately, likely to take place irregularly versus regularly, because opportunities for regular migration remain few and far between. And we're also likely to see it, I think this was another aspect that chapter touched on, the issue of conflict. We clearly are going to see a lot more conflict in the coming years and decades linked to dwindling resources that need to be shared somehow, either within countries or across countries. And I think a very obvious one is the one currently playing out on this continent in Africa between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia over the Gard. So there is a very clear link between climate change and the prospect of greater conflict in the years and decades to come. The African Union is not, has not put climate change and migration as a priority up till now, but that is beginning to shift. The African Union Commission is instituting sub-regional studies with selected regional economic commissions to look at how climate change is likely or is already impacting migratory movements and what policy implications can be derived from the evidence that is currently available. So again, you would expect that with Africa clearly being the one region globally that is likely to be disproportionately impacted by climate change, you would expect to see this be a top agenda of the African Union Commission. It hasn't yet been, but there's indications that this is changing. And it is, that can only be a good thing. Moving on to the next chapter on the impact of migration in developing countries. First of all, I'd like to say I really like the framing of it. I like that you're not talking about does migration cause or does development cause migration, which was a recent framing I had of it, which seems to suggest that migration is something to be stopped. And I think that that would be unfortunate if that was the prism through which a discussion on the complex interconnections between development and migration was approached. I like also that you take such a comprehensive perspective of development, looking at development from its economic, social, institutional, and environmental impacts. I found myself agreeing with a lot of what this chapter touches on, and perhaps let me just highlight the following. Economically, I think for the most part, we see a lot of evidence on the impact that migration has for countries of origin, presented in a very fragmented manner. You will either hear that, yes, because there's X billion of US dollars per year being remitted, migration is a positive, without necessarily balancing that out against the social and institutional and environmental impact. So there's field studies globally, I would have to say, that take this comprehensive view on migration to see how migration is impacting countries of origin. Great that your chapter is attempting to give it that comprehensive outlook, which is likely to give us a better picture of what migration means for country A versus country B, or for a certain region within a country, depending on who it is that is migrating. Does it result in greater inequality, or does it reduce inequality? Again, an important point that needs to be taken into account. I would say, though, that for the most part, the evidence in a lot of developing countries, given who it is that is migrating, is that migration tends to be a leveler of sorts. Poorer people become less poor as a result of having a family member sending money home from the Middle East, for example. You'll find that children who might otherwise not go to school are going to school because they have a member of their family working abroad and sending money home regularly. Health outcomes generally tend to be better for families that have a migrant member abroad than for those that don't. So on the inequality issue, I would say by and large, migration tends to be a leveler rather than a factor for increased inequality. And I say this despite the fact that we also know that it's not the poorest that migrate, because the poorest don't always have the wherewithal with which to undertake migratory journeys, regular or irregular. But that fact notwithstanding, migration has more of an equalizing effect than it does a fact of, enhanced of enhancing inequality between within societies. I'm not sure that the issue of decreased labor supply is one that there is much evidence for, that because a household is receiving remittances, its members are less likely to want to seek paid employment. I think for the most part, again, the remittances are a top-up rather than, the mainstay. If there is still the possibility for work, people will go out and seek that work, because again, whatever a migrant is remitting back home is not always sufficient for them to have a super luxurious life and sit back and do nothing. So I'm not sure I would agree with the point about decreased labor supply as a result of migrant remittances. I think I've touched on the social impact in terms of education and health, institutional and political. I thought that was interesting. And here I would like to make the following point, that given, again, how sometimes difficult a relationship countries have with their diasporas, it is quite clear that there is oftentimes going to be a very strong political impact, because those who migrate are aware of what the possibilities of life in a different socio-political setup has to offer, and have higher aspirations and expectations. And when they come back home, they try and transpose those ideas onto their home countries, and sometimes this has very destabilizing effects. And sometimes, again, diasporas will try and impact political change from a distance. So it again can be positive, but it also, in many instances, has proven to be destabilizing and has been negatively taken in the case of some countries. Environmental development and resilience, again, if you look at rapid onset disasters that cause people to move, whether within borders or across borders, there's going to be a lot of environmental destruction. I think the costs there are huge. Whenever there's an influx of be it IDPs or refugees, you're going to see a lot more trees cut down than might be the case if they had never, that influx had never happened. So yeah, a huge cost there of migration or mobility. And I could not agree more with the overall point you made. I think this was under social, on the costs of migration being, in terms of health costs, that is, being largely negative in terms of mental health, even if they might be positive in terms of physical health. And again, I think that's a really good distinction the chapter makes, which a lot of studies do not always look at. We see more studies that look at health in very general terms, as the ability to visit a hospital and pay the bill, but not in terms of the impact of family separation on a partner left behind, or on children that are left behind by one, or in some cases, both countries. The chapter on Asian migration governance, again, a lot of what the author presented is very familiar, looking at what the migration governance architecture on the African continent looks like. You talked of a lack, an unwillingness or a lack of enthusiasm and embracing any progress towards a global migration governance regime. And I think this is by and large the case for all other world regions, I would say. I don't know any world region that is agitating for a global migration regime. So the Asia experience, I think, is not necessarily unique in that sense. I think what we're seeing in Africa, for example, but I think likely to see in all other world regions, is precisely this kind of setup where there's enhanced regional cooperation, and with time that becomes, I mean, if I take the example of Africa, sub-regional cooperation and migration is very strong, and with time we're likely to see that become continental. And once that is fully operationalized and there's a certain level of comfort at that level, we can then begin to expect that, you know, some semblance of enhanced global cooperation or governance might begin to take root. But I think what we're seeing is very in Asia is very normal. I think that comfort level, for the most part, is still not there, and it's starting at a very sub-regional level, and the next level will be regional, i.e. continental, and eventually, hopefully, global. I fully agree, really interesting when you think about it, that the countries that are the most reluctant to ratify the convention, sign or ratify the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families, are oftentimes the very countries that you think should have an interest in doing so. Why that is lagging, continues to lag behind in the way that it does, especially in Asia, a continent that is such an important, you know, migrant worker sending continent, region, you know, I think is something we have to continuously interrogate, and I'm happy to have a further discussion on why that might be more so in that region than, you know, in others. You talked a lot about regional consultative processes. I'm familiar with many of the ones in Asia and their focus areas. Perhaps a good point here to point at the difference between the regional consultative processes in Asia and how they're structured versus how the regional consultative process on the African continent are operating. I think in Asia, they continue to operate as informal setups with non-binding agreements, basically bringing together member states that are like-minded to deliberate on issues of common concern. Africa, on the other hand, has gone a very different direction on this, where they've chosen to embed RCPs in regional economic communities with a view to ensuring that the outcomes are binding. I think this will be an interesting exercise at some point for academics to consider which ones have done better. The regional consultative processes whose setup is informal and whose outcomes are non-binding, or the ones that have taken the more formal route. I think the jury is still out on that one. And then looking at the fourth chapter on migration, development, nexus in selected African countries, again, I could perhaps I could say a lot of what you're saying has been said over and over again, and I think the civil society community in Europe has spoken at length to the fact that some of the migration policies that are coming out of Europe are not necessarily having the effect of addressing irregular migration. and the use of conditionality, the diversion of development funds towards security controls is raising not only the concern that the development objectives are being sacrificed, but are the objectives of curbing the incidence of irregular migration being met? Some would say actually yes, that there has been a reduction, a huge reduction in irregular migration since 2015 as a result of some of these actions. But one has to ask, at what cost? Yes, we are seeing fewer people cross the Mediterranean, but are we just making the routes that they follow even more dangerous? Are they dying in other paths as opposed to dying on the Mediterranean as a result of these actions, I think is the question one has to ask. And the point that the author made, which I think needs to be further emphasized, is that of policy coherence. I think we have a situation here where there is demand for migrant labor, perhaps not across the board, not in all parts of Europe, but there are pockets, there are countries in Europe that want to have regular migration programs with countries of origin. And then you have the supply end, where a lot of young people on a continent like this one, but equally in Asia, are seeking these opportunities. Unless and until governments take center stage, put themselves at the center of this process of matching labor supply to labor demand, we will continue to see the horrific scenes we see of deaths on the Mediterranean or in the Sahara, because people are taking ever more dangerous routes at the hands of human traffickers and migrant smugglers. And it behooves countries to take control of their situation. They, governments, rather than smugglers and traffickers, should be at the center of matching the supply to the demand. That is just not happening for reasons I think we can all understand, given what the public political opinion in Europe is. Talking about regular migration is potentially politically very costly. So there's work there to be done so that the public has a better understanding of why there is an opening of sorts for regular migration, and that process is well managed so that the citizenry do not feel that their government is losing control of the process and the floodgates are opening. But again, delicate political work there that needs to be done to change public minds and hearts about migration and see it for the opportunity that it is rather than the threat that it is oftentimes feared to represent. Perhaps I will just close by saying the following, since the book title is Regional Integration and Migration Governance in the Global South. I would like to just make a few points on what is happening in Africa in terms of progress towards enhanced migration governance. Over the past 4 years, some pretty important developments have taken place on the African continent, spurred by the African Union and some of the key decisions it has reached. And I'd like to point to 4 key policy decisions since 2016 to date. One, and perhaps the most important, is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the very celebrated AfCFTA, and along with it, the Continental Free Movement Protocol. I think it's helpful to think of the AFCFTA and the Free Movement Protocol as two sides of a coin. There isn't going to be free trade without free movement. And the data and evidence from other world regions clearly points to this. The regions that are the most integrated in terms of the free movement of persons are also the regions that have the highest rates of inter-regional trade, with Europe being right at the top, followed by North America, then Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa at the very bottom. The last statistics on that, I think, was 16% for Africa in terms of inter-regional trade. Not surprising when you consider that mobility on the African continent remains, I think, quite difficult. It's easier oftentimes for non-Africans to move freely within Africa than for Africans. That is something that the African Union has sought to address through these two, through the Free Movement Protocol most principally, but also the single African air transport market, and then the joint labor migration program. So those four key decisions, I repeat, AFCFTA, Free Movement Protocol, the single African air transport market, and then the joint labor migration program, intended to ensure that labor can move more freely on the continent to access opportunities wherever they exist through a controlled manner. Those four AU policy decisions, which of course are yet to be fully operationalized, if fully operationalized, will radically change the fortunes of this continent by ensuring that the benefits of free movement and free trade are fully harnessed, something that is just not happening at the moment. The Africa Development Bank has put out a study in 2018, I believe, pointing to the wealth creation that could result from enhanced inter-Africa trade, and free movement, again, goes with the free trade. So there isn't going to be one without the other. I like to think of these four key policy decisions almost as four wheels of a vehicle. You need all of these four instruments fully operationalized for the continental integration agenda as encapsulated in the Agenda 2063's 10-year action plan. These four policy instruments are key to achieving that. And progress on each one of them is at different stages, but again, it's moving ahead. So a very clear continental commitment to integration and enhanced integration within which migration governance issues are being carefully considered. Again, as I indicated earlier, I think we will likely see progress more at sub-regional level in the immediate term, and with time at continental level, but that is still, I would say, some way off, perhaps another decade off before we see a fully integrated African continent in terms of free movement of persons. Again, given wealth disparities, even within African countries, it's understandable why some regions are less inclined to move with speed on continental integration and free movement than others, with ECOWAS and EAC being at the forefront of the free movement agenda. Perhaps I would just end by saying that there is, and I don't say this to cast this whole discussion negatively, but I think really just to point to the fact that there is something that I can only characterize as something of a collective failure of the imagination that keeps countries afraid of, and again, even in the developing world, afraid of embracing the potential positive impact of well-managed migration. And I cannot help but go back to this 2018 study of the Economist Intelligence Unit that points to the fact that world of free movement would be $78 trillion richer. So it really is a failure of the imagination, collective failure of the imagination. And I'm hopeful that books such as the one that this UNU has put out will begin to spur more reflection in this direction that, you know, begins to open minds to the incredible potential that well-managed migration can have, and to the fact that it is increasingly inevitable, especially when we consider the impacts of climate change and how they're likely to affect migration patterns moving forward. I'll stop at that, and I thank you very much for your attention. You will forgive me if I have to leave in another 5 minutes. I need to get out of here at 5:45, but I'm available for the next 7 or so minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a really inspiring reflection. We are already over time, so I would like to keep the last part very brief, but still would want to come back to just a few questions that appeared in the chat, which I will summarize for the sake of time, and give the word also to the presenters, who I would also like to ask to answer briefly. So just grouping a bit of questions that came from Dereje Regasa, if I'm pronouncing your name right, related to the chapter that I presented on environmental change and migration. And the question was particularly to what extent we account for differences in the degree of coercion that is assumed to play when it comes to environmental displacement, and then also with respect to the lack of a legal international framework for climate-induced migration, and how we see this in relation to the priorities in terms of migration governance. So just briefly on the first question, in the chapter, we don't distinguish between forced displacement and voluntary displacement. We just consider any potential form of mobility is in relation with climate change, following the IOM definition, basically, of environmental migrants. And then with respect to the lack of a legal international framework for climate migrants, this is definitely indeed true that more needs to be done to protect people who are affected by climate change, and that the West has an important responsibility on that front, especially because the ones who are the most vulnerable are primarily located in countries which have disproportionately less emitted or contributed to emissions behind global warming and climate change. So you list in the chat a few reasons for why this legal refugee status is not there for climate migrants. And to those that you raise, I would also add that it's probably also to do with the fact that it's so difficult to single out the effect of climate change on migration, right? Which is something we also pointed out a bit in the literature overview, and which you also see from the transmission channels that I've listed, which mostly show that the impact of climate change on migration runs through indirect channels, right? Through the impact on income, through the impact on conflict, and so on. So I think this stresses again how important it is to be able to show this causal relationship, and how talking about climate migrants and doing research on environmental migration as such can also be helpful to bring more attention to this issue and way on policy making with respect to protection of the rights of migrants on that front. So I'll leave it here with respect to this question. Maybe then there were two more specific questions. I will leave the more general one, which was raised to all of us, maybe aside. For Melissa, there was a question from Marlies Kazir, who missed attention for the strengthening of public sectors in immigration countries. She said that improvements in health would rather be at the household level of migrant families, but not at a national level, and that migration does not seem to contribute in building stronger states that provide for their citizens. And to Maud, there was a question of Ruben Wissing, who asked, how do EU policymakers assess the migration hump identified by the House, which shows that development in the first instance increases migration intentions. So I'll let you two answer this briefly, and then I'm afraid we will need to leave further questions for another time, so that we can close at least in like a few minutes. Melissa, you have the floor.
Great, thanks. So I'll be quick here. So in the review, of course, we were looking at what the current literature says, and it's not to say at all that that migration cannot affect the broader public sector. There are some papers on this, especially when it comes to more like democracy institutions. And there is some also on kind of broader public sector health, things like that. But you're right that the majority of papers don't look at this as much. I think also because it's a little bit harder to measure than those micro level effects. But I did not mean in any way to suggest that this is not also a possible positive effect of migrants. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there.
Yes, so I'll also be short. So in my interviews, EU officials recognize the migration hump. So they acknowledge that development projects will only generate results over longer periods of time. But they say it's essential to invest in these durable solutions, even though the public might ask for immediate measures. That was the main message, but they also said that more development aid will not only generate results over longer periods of time, but that there will also be short-term results with regard to that it can help partner countries that experience large flows of outward migration to better distribute the positive and the negative effects of migration. So that was very short, the main message that they gave me.
All right, thank you very much. I think that anyone else who would want to continue the discussion is welcome to contact me if you want to, because you have my email address and the invitation, and then I can forward the email to the presenter. I will give the final word to Catherine, who will close the session.
Thank you very much, Ilse. I will also keep it very short in the interest of time. So as Glenn said earlier when he introduced the book, our real goal was to initiate the discussion, both within and beyond the UN-EU Migration Network, on the priorities for migration governance in and for the Global South. So that was really our aim. And I think the discussions that we've had today already were a good start for that. And we really hope that that continues. So just to give a little bit more of a teaser of the book, in the book we drew two main policy conclusions for migration governance in the Global South. And I think they also resonate well with some of the discussions that were just had, actually. So firstly, we really put forward that there's a need to view migration and development policy not so much as substitutes, so not as addressing the root causes, but really as this complementary kind of approach, as Maud really well also presented today. And then our second conclusion relates very much to what Richard presented today in terms of the relevance of multilateralism in the interest of safe, regular, and orderly migration. And also Ms. Marine really focused on this kind of cooperation on the continental level even, to really facilitate these movements much more. And that's really necessary in the interest of managing the complex migration flows that we're observing increasingly in the Global South and between countries also in the Global South. And I think that that's where I will leave it. Obviously, in the book, we go much more into detail into these recommendations, and you're, of course, more than welcome to read the book and to kind of move along with our thoughts there. But then that brings us to the end of the book launch webinar. Thank you very much to all of you for being here and for staying over time also. We want to really thank all of the authors that presented today their chapters, as well as the other authors that contributed to the book that were obviously not able to present today in the interest of time. We also really want to thank Ms. Marina Ching for taking the time to be with us and share her very valuable insights with us today. It really gave me a lot of food for thought, and I hope it's the same for everyone else here too. And in that sense, yeah, I think that's where I will leave it. I don't know if Ilse or Glenn would like to say anything else. Otherwise, I wish everyone a happy holiday season and a good start to the new year. And hopefully we will have further discussions on these issues then in 2021.
Okay. Have a nice day, everyone, and thank you for being here.